Welcome to Social Work Foundations. I'm Dr. Karen Smith-Bertabi. In this lecture, we'll give an overview of the history of the profession of social welfare as our focal points, very much focused in on the United States. And the concepts will include how social problems and those problems of poverty have merged from the earliest of social welfare history. We'll think about empowerment and social control as we explore the profession from a global perspective. We're mindful of the dominant knowledge and being integrative of global knowledges about social problems and interventions is important. We're going to look very closely at the charity organization societies, and that's the historical figure of Mary Richmond, as well as the settlement house movement, and Jane Addams is a part of that historical figure. Others like E. Franklin Frazier and his work for the American Southeast and focus on African Americans will also be discussed, as we don't ever want to forget the people of color in our history. Globally, we have core social problems, and we'll touch upon those at the end of this presentation to think about migration, HIV/AIDS, child protection, elders, and others. As we define social work, the global perspective is essential, and we recognize that social work as a profession began in the United States, England, as well as the European continent. It's important that we are mindful of the present in this presentation, as it often takes on a narrative of our history that can be exclusive and forget those people who have been a part of the process, because the dominant narrative will talk very narrowly, frequently, quite often, about white people, Caucasians, and their involvement in the history of social work. We don't want to create a neocolonial framing of social problems and solutions or interventions. So we have a high resource perspective in the United States, and we can find ourselves silencing the low resource knowledge, including indigenous knowledge. So the indigenous knowledge that comes from the rootedness of the First Nations people, or also indigenous knowledge in places like Africa, where you have First Nations people there and tribal groups, just as we do here in the United States. When we look at social problems, these ideas of bringing together knowledges from a variety of perspectives is important, and we'll be touching upon some of our earliest theory building today. When presenting historical figures, the perspective is certainly U.S. based, and this is really based on the fact, partially, that the United States has taken such an active role in the development of social work education. So let's start with ancient times. And we've been responding to human needs since the beginning. And think about the three sources of help, of support for the individual or family. We have family groups, neighborhood, and religious leaders. So that brings us to some important questions. In your own life today, are the above sources support still helping today? Family, neighbor, religion? They certainly remain core to most people's networks of family and friends, as well as the intersections of religion and moral values. Think about your own experiences. Is the family and neighborhood important to your own resource system? How about faith leaders? Simply, is faith important to you? It's important as a social worker to have self-awareness about this aspect of your moral framework. You may find that you have different values related to faith as compared to your clients. We must be self-aware, as faith organizations and leaders can be important or not, depending on what the client believes and values. We never want to impose our faith values on others. Social welfare is both the formal and non-formal processes that contribute to human well-being. A formalized system requires laws and social policies. Taking the long view of history, we begin with the Poor Law as the starting place of Egypt and Mesopotamia. These laws predate what we call the cradle of civilization: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. The earliest of laws and policies formally expressed the importance of charity for poor as an obligation of organized religion. Continuing with ancient history, you can see an array of developments across different religions and societies. Faith organizations have been important to defining social welfare and setting forth a charity approach to social problems. The idea of relief to the poor is the core of actions in the medieval period. So you'll see monks in monasteries providing services for people with disabilities. those who would be called indigent, and others. The indigent are really those who are in deep poverty, unable to really care for themselves because of some problems like disability. We're talking about the experience of poverty. Monasteries used to provide food and shelter for pilgrims, those traveling for religious purposes, soldiers, beggars, and medical responses to health needs. So, hospitals. Monks and nuns cared for abandoned children, often due to hunger or other problems related to poverty. So, here we have that question of social control versus empowerment. In this particular era, a lot of this is related to social control. You had to show your faith in order to gain access to the monks and monasteries. So the faith being connected to access to care is really a core of an issue that we would find during that time period of social control. So here we have the European roots. Let's look at the Elizabethan Poor Laws here. The idea of almsgiving, or food and money for the poor as beggars, is seen as a nuisance, and obligations of formalized care being a part of government activity. So with the Elizabethan Poor Laws, we have three classes of the poor: able-bodied, impotent poor, and dependent children. So really clearly, this is where you start seeing the question of whether or not an individual or family is of the deserving poor or the undeserving poor. And undeserving people were seen as lazy. So these are the quote, quote, able-bodied that are poor. And they are being, at this point, seen as really not being effective and being put down in the society's worldview of their functioning or not functioning in society. So they are the able-bodied, or the seen as lazy. Two major threads in the U.S. history to come forward to the last 120 years. Two major threads in U.S. history in the profession are the Charity Organization Society and the Settlement House movement. First, we'll look at the Charity Organization Society as that pulls together the various charities. And early on, Mary Richmond is the critical figure. This might be called the friendly visitor model, where wealthy women and wives and daughters of respectable men, including faith leaders, reach out into the community, going into people's homes, serving as role models. These women, very well intended, very much perpetuated the control elements of the society and how people were viewing the poor, going into marginalized neighborhoods, making outreach, showing people a better way of living. And that turns into a form of social control very quickly, because that's the dominant worldview being placed upon others. And you have cross-cultural issues, you have social class issues, most certainly. And then you have those issues of faith and superimposing your faith belief on others. So we can find ourselves very quickly into the control model there. Then we have the Settlement House movement, which is community-based services oriented to citizen participation, education, and advocacy. Jane Addams and the women of Hull House are very critically important in that period. And that particular model was oriented to pulling together the community to serve themselves, to make what they could for themselves and then advocate for what they needed. We'll look at that closer. Just please note the Legacies of Social Change, 100 Years of Profession of Social Work in the U.S. is a critical video. This video goes across the whole range of leaders in our movement and social work forward and social progressiveness, and that video is a must view. Okay, let's begin with Mary Richmond's social diagnosis, which comes from the Charity Organization Society. In order to intervene with individuals, Mary Richmond recognized the need to make formalized assessments of the individual and the family in their social environment. She developed this set of nested systems that you'll see here. And this is the earliest development of what we would call today human ecology, the framing of person and their environment. Richmond called these interacting systems the social forces that impact those served. Richmond is considered the mother of social casework, and her earliest contributions, especially this figure, dates over 100 years ago, and they continue to be celebrated as the earliest of social work texts to guide engagement, Social Diagnosis being the title of her 1917 text. It's written from the perspective of the Charity Organization Society. We've talked about some of the limitations based on social control, but nonetheless, this is important work. And in this framework, we have the person environment or the assessment framework. And Mary Richmond was deeply concerned about the causes of poverty, social exclusion, and individual functioning as they function in their environment. She was really the first social worker to set forth the methodology of analysis. So even while the Charity Organization Society, it can be oriented to control, many good ideas came out of this time period in this approach to social problems. Here we have an updated graphic that we would think about today as a more complex conception of human ecology with multiple and interrelated systems that are flexible. You can see the micro, meso, and macro scales of practice with the person and environment, with transactions and interactions across the systems in a dynamic environment. The largest scale is the society in which you find laws, policies, and conceptions of human rights. Then there's the community context as we go down, in which we start to think about how the community impacts individuals, and that would include institutions, programs, and services. Then within that nesting, we have groups, small groups, tribes, associations. You'd even find mutual aid groups here. Within there, you had the family and then the individual. Now look at all these different prongs of social dynamics, spiritual, faith dynamics, education, economic, political, psychological, biological, and sexual. These are all the social forces upon the individual in the larger society. This is a very complex graphic compared to what Richmond started with. And it helps us, again, think about making assessment of what the problem is, where the sources of problems are, and recognizing that rarely is it the individual that's at fault. There are so many social forces coming into play that there's an interaction between individual and environment as well as a transaction. Now think about all these nested circles. They suggest kind of rigid systems. They are not. They're very flexible. They're porous. Information, resources, transactions are moving across these systems. And you'll see that there's the overlay of social norms in the culture. So these are the rules for engagement in a society. Frequently there's dominant frameworks for what the norms are, what the expectations are. And these are important to thinking about how the individual works and accesses what they need in their environment or finds challenges in their environment. So now you can see that we've expanded upon Richmond's ideas today with greater dimension of the human experience with the ecological perspective. Let's shift over to the community organizing and the settlement house movement. Jane Addams and Ella Gates Starr dedicated their lives to the settlement house movement after they observed the model in London. Addams and the women of Hull House developed the first neighborhood-based family support model where people came together to support each other, learn new skills, and engage in activities oriented to family support and neighborhood well-being. Addams went on to later win a Nobel Prize for her activism and pacifist views related to World War II. While she was respected for that Nobel Prize, she also came underneath great criticism by the general public with attacks in the major newspapers for her pacifist views. And Addams largely started to retreat from public life as she aged because the criticism was so fierce. This is just an aside. That's an important little piece of information about Addams, as she was quite a public figure, arguably one of the most public figures ever in social work. But please note, she didn't necessarily call herself a social worker because this predates the development of the profession. She was a faculty member of the Chicago School of Sociology, and this was a leading group of sociologists that made many contributions to knowledge, especially theory, including urban studies and human ecology ideas. They were very early in the ideas of human ecology. Okay, we don't want to overlook people of color in the history of social work in the United States. It's always important to take that special care and attention, as the dominant voices can overlook these important strides forward. Franklin Frazier was an important scholar in the study of American families in the Southeast, specifically African Americans. And he was critical as a sociologist, again as a sociologist, in developing social work education at historically black institutions, and notably establishing the study of the profession at Howard University in Washington, D.C. When looking at African American history and social work, note that the settlement house movement also served African American communities. Minneapolis had a really important example of the settlement house movement for African Americans that were coming to urban centers seeking opportunities, leaving the Southeast. Now, we've just covered three critical figures here, and we always need to ask ourselves, what are the other people of color? How are Latinos involved? We know that there was a settlement house movement in Texas for Latinos. What about other populations? How about Asians? Lesser is known about these groups of people because they have been lesser represented in the field, but we always need to be asking ourselves, how have they contributed to our knowledge and our development of the profession? There are many more ideas that you can find in that video, Legacies of Change, including the timeline and contributions such as related to social policy and the major advances like Social Security. Now, we talked about sociology being an important discipline that informs the profession, but we also need to think about other systems and theories that we consider to be important in social work. We've already talked about the ecological perspective or person and environment, and here we have Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which comes from the psychology tradition. This is probably one of the most commonly referred to theories early in your study, with the exception of person and environment. And Maslow, the psychology, developed the framework to help us think about the needs of the individual, and beginning at the bottom of the pyramid, the basic needs of food, shelter, clothing, clean water, and then moving up the pyramid in human growth and development. Public services like hospitals are important, as well as acceptance at the community level. So you can imagine basic needs like hospitals and other public services, but then moving into the emotional levels of connection of acceptance within the community, within your social group. These are differing resources. These are formal resources as well as non-formal resources coming together for the social welfare of the people. And as we look at this pyramid, this isn't about social control. This is really about empowerment. And with the resources that are necessary, we move up this hierarchy of needs. And we must ask ourselves, for the vulnerable people, they frequently are caught at this lower level of the pyramid. How do we give them the opportunities to move up this pyramid and start to gain a sense of love and belonging in their community, and then their personal sense of self-esteem and confidence and sense of achievement, and then heading towards self-actualization at the very top, in which people experience creativity, spontaneity, and problem solving, as well as the sense of tolerance in the community, in which people are not acting with prejudice but are welcoming, and then also the acceptance of fact. How do we help vulnerable people move up this pyramid is one of the questions we always have to ask ourselves as a psychologist or sociologist or social worker, especially as a social worker. Think about this. We've talked about sociologists and psychologists, and now we're talking about applying social work to this pyramid. We borrow from these disciplines to start to move towards an empowerment-based discipline and a profession. Okay, so what makes us unique as social workers is we're always looking at the resource needs. This goes above and beyond what the sociologists and the psychologists typically do. So let's look at the left side of this graphic. These are the human needs similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You recognize these: personal security needs, belonging and esteem needs, and then personal human fulfillment needs: education, recreation, accomplishment of tasks for their own sense of meaningful work, and even religion, a sense of faith in the God for many people, not everybody, but many people. And then on the right-hand side, you have resource needs to meet all of these elements as you move up the community pyramid. And so think about, at the very bottom, we have societal institutions. I already mentioned hospitals, but think about clinics as well as mental health care. Also think about police and community security systems that reflect people's rights, human rights, a sense of faith in the police. That's been a really important part of the national discourse right now in the Black Lives Matter movement. There are other social institutions such as non-governmental organizations, local nonprofits, human services organizations, places where people go for social services like food banks. Also, formalized systems include education systems, as well as even economic services that might be available at the county level as a formalized government service. Moving up the pyramid, we have social acceptance, receiving positive feedback from others, a sense of community, and opportunities for us to come together and share our ideas, our desires, our wants, our needs, and share accomplishments. As you move up the pyramid, these are the resource needs. We need good schools, we need good parks, we need an opportunity to work, the opportunity for good, solid employment, resource need, access to places to learn about religion, practice faith, pray, etc. So this is the idea of not only Maslow's needs and moving up across the pyramid, but also the resource needs coming together. The argument here for us as social workers is you can't really move towards the top of Maslow's pyramid without addressing the resource needs in communities, and that's a critical element of social work as we try to move towards empowerment, providing opportunities so people can reach their fullest potential versus charity or social control. So giving people opportunity, providing opportunity, and having a social environment in which the individual and family can reach their fullest potential. I think it's really important to think about how do people reach their fullest potential. It's not about giving, it's about making opportunities available. And it's about providing the resources needed. Okay, well, let's go back to empowerment again. Considering the quality of life and access to resources in the community, as we just looked at, we have to think again about empowerment. It is a process that enables individuals or groups to fully access personal or collective power, authority, or influence when they engage with others, institutions, or society, seeking resources and opportunities. In social work, the intention is that the empowered person feels a greater confidence and strength as they improve their own well-being. This means providing the opportunity, providing the resources, providing the social environment for well-being and to reach fullest potential. I hope that you're starting to see the difference between charity and empowerment at this point as we discuss social work and the major ideas in the history of social work. Okay, in this table you'll see many of the summarizing points about the discipline of social work that we've been covering so far. And these are the values and principles at the first top of this chart. And principles, by the way, are the rules. I think sometimes that word gets a little complicated, but the values are rules. And think about confidentiality. There's absolutely a rule for that. But we also have the basic ideas of dignity and worth of the person and social justice. These are values-based orientations to our work. We work from a non-judgmental perspective as much as we possibly can. We engage in an ethical conduct as we move forward with others in a trustworthy manner. We're always thinking about self-determination and access to resources. Then we have knowledge. I've already talked to you about sociology and psychology, and we have the actual philosophy of social work too, the discipline where we come from as a profession. And we do draw upon theories of human behavior across a range of disciplines. We recognize that cultural diversity is critical, and we are always thinking about family systems, community systems, and groups. And all of this comes together in family dynamics and group dynamics, as well as development of systems. We talk about community development. We understand that policy is a critical framework as we move forward in working with individuals, understanding that laws, legislation, administrative policies impact individuals and families and communities. We have a great deal of self-knowledge as social workers. I've already posed to you, how does your faith impact working with others? Do you have self-awareness? Because your faith value system may be different from others. It probably is. You need to be aware of that so that we don't impose our faith views on others. That's a sense of self-knowledge. You will continue to explore those ideas as we move along in learning about social work. We have a range of theories that we draw from elsewhere, and you will continue to think about those and overlay those on many of the practice scenarios that we will present. We have a set of skills. This is the toolbox. We think critically. We're always involved in building relationships with others, again, acting in a trustworthy manner. We're always thinking about empowerment, and we have a whole range of practice methods and practice models. We must always be culturally competent, and I've talked about cultural competence just by acknowledging neocolonial values or views and silencing people of color. That's just the beginning. That's just the starting point of cultural competence. Awareness of others, always thinking about how you can be more effective working across groups, within groups, and considering diversity, considering oppression is critical, especially in this time when we're being really confronted with issues of race, racism, and social injustice during the Black Lives Matter movement. Also, just from a nuts and bolts perspective, we have really critical needs around being literate for computers, technology, and then we must engage in social planning on large scale, as well as working with individuals and family in crisis intervention. So here we have a whole range of social work values, knowledge, and skills that have been provided by Dubot and Miley in the textbook Social Work and Empowering Profession. Okay, so we know that social work is found in over 100 countries today. There are a variety of social problems that social workers engage in, and those social problems are so complex, and they really create greater and greater demand on social workers. And if you follow the International Federation of Social Work, you will find that social workers from around the world are gathering to share knowledge, to help each other with resources, and to continue to develop the profession, because this is very dynamic. The social problems that emerge every day, new and challenging environments, but also opportunities to collaborate to make major difference in responding to social problems. As change agents, we respond to a variety of needs, from collective violence, poverty, HIV/AIDS, even family planning, aging, child protection, and so much more. So we think about collective violence. This, you might call this war or conflict, including civil conflict. And we are responding to collective violence when we're moving forward in social movements, for instance, to address landmines. A major social movement to address landmines, social workers are involved in that. That's large-scale human rights frameworks and large-scale international law. But we also are thinking about distribution of human and economic resources at the direct level, and you'll find charity models literally sending in direct aid to communities affected by war. Charity models, again, they can get confused with social control, but they do have their place, because there are times when we just must mobilize resources, especially when it comes to hunger. We always have to think about gender inequality being addressed in the context of war and strife, because women and children are at great risk of exploitation, including issues like war rape. These are really critically important, pressing issues that we as social workers bring knowledge of trauma-informed practices, how to work with vulnerable people who've experienced serious problems like sexual assault in the war context. So we're always thinking about how do we enhance women's status and safety, as well as protecting elders. Related health problems in the context of civil strife include substance abuse, mental health, regular solid health issues like heart disease and other problems that are just standard across the world. And then we've got very specific conflict disabilities like PTSD, as well as physical disabilities such as limb loss. So we recognize that the 20th century is one of the most violent in human history. We have the highest rates of conflict-related deaths found in Africa and the Middle East. You can think of Syria, for instance. Thousands upon thousands have now died, as well as been displaced elsewhere in neighboring countries like Jordan and Turkey and elsewhere. We have the largest number of displaced persons globally, and it's a clear and persistent problem currently in the age of people moving for safety from countries above and beyond Syria, as well as people going elsewhere for economic purposes, seeking livelihood, seeking the opportunity for solid and fair work. This is the largest movement of people experienced since World War II. And within this, there's the inclusion of asylum seeking and the need to recognize people as refugees. We have gender-based violence taking place, as we already stated, during war, but I also want you to think globally about some of the major gender-based violence issues, such as female genital mutilation, child marriage, and early childbearing, as well as human trafficking and other kinds of violences against women. Gender-based violence has serious consequences on physical health for women, and that includes their sexual and reproductive health very specifically, as well as their mental health. It is a violation of a woman's human rights and has economic adversities and social consequences for men, women, their children, families, and communities. So we've already mentioned Africa and Middle East as having major problems. And actually, in the Southern Africa region, there's 7 countries with 20% of those aged 15 to 24 years reported that they'd experienced sexual violence from an intimate partner. 7 countries. Sexual violence against early adolescents at the age of 15 years is now at the highest in conflict and post-conflict countries of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mozambique, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. The high rate of violence against women and girls in the region is maintained by the persistence of harmful gender norms. This is the cultural overlays, but these are harmful gender norms. Alcohol use and overall increased poverty. There's violence in slum areas and in conflict areas. Partner violence, or what we call domestic violence in the United States, is that which happens within families, and there's always the problem of young girls and how do we prevent them from being abused. And sometimes that means that they get put into early marriage, and that's a reality, and we always are looking to work against that because early marriage is so stunting of opportunity, but also puts girls in risk of early childbirth, which has wide-ranging health implications. So let's talk about poverty, because these problems that we've covered so far are rooted in poverty. And this is true now, as well as all the progress that we've made since the beginning of our discussion of the recent history. So the poor suffer from malnutrition, illiteracy, poor health, premature death, and an overall sense of hopelessness. And we want to always think about how do we move forward from a social development perspective. Now look at these intertwining forces. We have the social forces and economic dynamics coming together, and if they're positive inputs in planned social change, social development can be the outcome in which everybody's included into the economic well-being with thoughtfulness about programs, services, and policies to engage all in a prosperous future so that they can reach their highest potential. So we have all these inequalities. We know that women are at greater risk. We know that children have access to care as well as elders. These are issues that come from poverty. How do we access care and services? And it's really important to recognize that there are some really terrible social indicators that give us a sense of what's really happening, either locally or around the world. Every 1 minute, a woman dies during pregnancy or during childbirth because they did not receive adequate care or prompt treatment. This remains a problem in the United States today. And we know that older people, elders who've experienced a lifetime of poor diet, multiple pregnancies, inadequate reproductive health care, physical labor, often enter old age in poor health, and they need special care and attention. Vulnerable populations. Let's start with elder care. We know that they're a diverse group. They experience varying degrees of dependencies on external support. In the United States, we have a social security system very much oriented to elders, so that there is a stipend, very small stipend, for people who are elders, as well as those with disabling conditions before their elder years. In less developed countries, elders often live in extreme poverty and social exclusion, and they have isolation as a global reality. In the United States, even with some care structures in place, social isolation is a serious problem. We also find a frequent lack of access to adequate and affordable health care, and this is especially true in rural areas. And we have some elders being confronted with financial, emotional, and physical abuse. This would be called elder abuse. We just need to remember that traditional family support mechanisms have been eroded due to declining family size, people moving from rural to urban migration, urbanization, and the declining of co-residence, the declining of households in which multiple generations live together. We also, in some countries, especially in Africa, have older family members caring for the younger. In fact, you have grandparents caring for the children who have been called orphaned due to AIDS, with the missing generation. And that's a really serious and pressing issue that continues to be a point of focus for many social workers in Africa as well as elsewhere. We have older women being at increased risk for violence and human rights abuses, especially during times of conflict. And this is particularly true in low-resource countries. Let's turn to the other end of the life course, child protection. We have children, and they must be protected from a range of abuses to include family and societal violence. When we talk about child protection from a global perspective, we're talking more than just child abuse and neglect. We recognize that abuses are connected to poverty, such as harsh physical punishment of children within the family, and it's also connected to the stress of living in poverty frequently, as the global definition of child protection requires us to think in systems. How do we develop care systems like good schools, good nutritional opportunities, good health care? How do we provide systems of care for children? In the United States, we tend to be more narrow, and we think about child protection and child welfare quite synonymously, and their focus is primarily on child abuse and neglect within the family system, whereas globally, the definition of child protection is broader, looking at the many different support structures within a society. As we orient ourselves to identifying abuse and neglect in the United States, we need to recognize that the idea is mandated services. So these are services in child protection in which the child has been identified at risk, it's been determined that there is a abuse or neglect occurring, and services become mandated or required, typically with oversight by the courts, with case plans and the strategies laid out within a case planning process that's mindful of what the statutory requirements are. Social workers have been historically important leaders in child protection, and we work directly with children and their families to resolve problems. It can be said that social work actually even owns the area of child welfare or child protection, as we have been the earliest to involve ourselves, and we've made a clear specialty area of child protection. We've come to the end of our presentation. I encourage you to go to www.socialworktogo.com for more information. Thank you.